She organized a perfect evening in honor of her mother-in-law, hoping to become part of the family. But instead of gratitude, it was humiliation in front of all the guests. Subscribe and tell me what city you're from in the comments. Jasmine stood by the window of her modest apartment on Chicago's South Side, watching the late autumn drizzle streak the glass in thin, silvery lines. The city outside pulsed with movement. Buses sighed to a stop, heels clicked along damp sidewalks, and the groan of the elevated train rumbled like a distant thunder. Inside, though, there was a fragile stillness, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She clutched the steaming mug of ginger tea in her hands, not drinking, just holding. The heat steadied her. Today wasn't a day for rushing. It was a day for remembering, for bracing. The chipped frame on the wall held a photo of her mother in a nurse's uniform, flanked by her grandmother and a much younger Jasmine with her two baby brothers in her lap. All three women in the picture had the same determined tilt to the chin, the same fire in the eyes, even through struggle. That fire had carried them all forward, through eviction notices, 3 jobs at a time, police sirens at night, and teachers who had called her articulate like it was a miracle. Jasmine had made it through, not without scars, but she was whole. Now, at 31, she was a school administrator at one of the top charter schools in the city, working to expand programs for underprivileged youth, raising money for scholarships, mentoring kids who looked like she once had, hungry, smart, and invisible. She had made something of herself, not by asking permission, but by refusing to take no for an answer. She had not, however, expected to fall in love, and certainly not with someone like Lucas. They had met at an education conference in D.C., both speaking on a panel about equity and access to higher education. She remembered the way his smile had caught her off guard, not just polite, but curious. He had leaned in when she spoke, asked her about her work afterward, stayed beside her all through the post-panel mingling. At first, she had been wary. A tall, well-groomed white man with a slow southern drawl and a tailored suit wasn't exactly the kind of ally she'd grown used to. But Lucas had something rare. A softness without condescension, a genuine willingness to listen, and, more than that, a track record of doing the work. He was an attorney focused on civil rights law, advocating for fair housing and systemic reform. He moved through the world with the kind of confidence that was taught in prep schools, but with a decency that couldn't be. They fell in love slowly, carefully, both aware of how fragile and rare their connection was. Lucas visited Chicago often. Jasmine spent weekends in Atlanta where he lived, learning his rhythms, his routines. She met his friends, most of them lawyers, professors, well-meaning liberals who greeted her warmly, but with the slightest edge of curiosity, like a piece of art they weren't sure how to interpret. Lucas never flinched. He called out microaggressions when they happened. He called her brilliant, beautiful, powerful. When he proposed, it was under a tree in Grant Park, and her yes had come out choked, not because she wasn't sure, but because she had never before felt chosen in a way that didn't ask her to become something she wasn't. But there was one shadow she couldn't shake, even in her happiest moments. His mother, Evelyn. She had seen pictures, a thin woman in pearls and pastel blouses, her hair a perfect blonde bob, her expression always somewhere between amused and assessing. Lucas spoke of her with a cautious fondness. She was traditional, exacting, elegant. She had grown up in Savannah, Georgia, and lived there still in the family estate just outside the city. Evelyn had been a socialite before it went out of style, chaired boards, raised Lucas after his father's sudden death, and remained the cornerstone of old money Southern society. Lucas had tried to ease Jasmine in gently. "She's just set in her ways," he had said, "but she'll come around. Once she meets you, how could she not love you?" That was 4 months ago. Jasmine had since spoken to Evelyn twice over the phone. Once to thank her for a birthday gift she hadn't picked out, a cashmere scarf with the tag still on. The second time had been to discuss Thanksgiving plans. Evelyn had sounded polite, almost clipped, with pauses that stretched too long and a tone that made Jasmine feel like a telemarketer. After they hung up, Jasmine had sat for a long time on her couch, staring at the blank TV screen, feeling the weight of something she couldn't name. And yet, when Lucas suggested they visit Savannah for Evelyn's upcoming birthday, Jasmine hadn't hesitated. Not only would she go, she would host the celebration. It had been her idea, a gesture of goodwill, a way to show Evelyn that she respected her, that she was willing to embrace tradition, to bridge whatever silent divide might exist. Lucas had looked at her then, his brows lifted in a mix of admiration and relief. "She'll love that," he said. "Seriously, Jasmine, wow, that's generous." She had smiled, even as something cold twisted inside her, because it wasn't generosity, it was survival. She threw herself into planning. With her own money, she rented out a historic Southern venue that she knew Evelyn admired, the Lacewood Hall, a Greek revival mansion often used for weddings and charity galas. She pored over catering menus, taste-tested pralines and finger sandwiches, researched Evelyn's favorite flowers, white camellias and pink azaleas, and curated a playlist of classical piano interspersed with Ella Fitzgerald, subtle enough not to offend, but a thread of her own roots woven through. She contacted Evelyn's closest friends and organized a series of video messages from those who couldn't attend. She hired a florist from Savannah's Black Business Directory, knowing full well that the name might raise eyebrows. She chose a champagne dress for herself, sleek, elegant, modest, and made sure it matched the linens. Her friends in Chicago were stunned. "You're throwing a party for the woman who won't even call you by your first name?" one had asked, half joking, half concerned. Jasmine had laughed it off. "It's just one night," she'd said. "I'm not doing this for her. I'm doing this so I never have to wonder if I could have tried harder." The night before they left for Savannah, Lucas had taken her hands and said, "You're incredible. You know that? She's going to see it. She has to." Jasmine had only nodded, her throat too tight for words, because part of her wanted to believe him, but a deeper part, a part that had learned to read the room before she even entered it, already knew the truth. The flight to Savannah was smooth. Lucas held her hand most of the way, pointing out landmarks as they descended. Jasmine gazed at the winding rivers and stretches of moss-draped trees with a quiet apprehension. Savannah was beautiful, hauntingly so, but the beauty felt like a facade, like the gleaming smile of someone who would gut you the moment you turned away. They drove to Evelyn's estate in a rented black SUV. The house loomed behind wrought iron gates, a 2-story monument to tradition with tall columns, ivy-covered brick, and a porch wide enough to land a helicopter. The air smelled of damp earth and something sweeter, wisteria maybe, or jasmine, which felt almost like a taunt. Evelyn answered the door herself, her posture impeccable, her smile brittle. "Well," she said, eyeing Jasmine up and down, "I suppose we should say welcome, shouldn't we?" Lucas kissed his mother on the cheek. "Hi, Mom. This is Jasmine." Evelyn extended her hand, cool and bony. "Charmed, I'm sure." Jasmine shook it. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Whitmore." Evelyn will do." She turned on her heel and led them inside without another word. The interior was all antique furniture, crystal chandeliers, and family portraits in oil paint. Lucas carried their bags upstairs while Evelyn gave Jasmine a perfunctory tour, pointing out various heirlooms and architectural details with the casual pride of someone who had never had to earn a thing. "This room has been in the family since 1824, she said, gesturing to a parlor with floor-length curtains and a grand piano. "My great-grandfather's plantation money built most of this house. Different times, of course." Jasmine said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the sharpest response. That night, at dinner, Evelyn served roast duck and grits with collard greens. She poured Jasmine a glass of white wine, but offered none to Lucas. "I think Jasmine needs it more," she said lightly, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Lucas frowned. "Mom." "What?" Evelyn said. "I'm just being hospitable." Jasmine forced a laugh. "Thank you. Everything looks wonderful." "Oh, it's nothing fancy," Evelyn replied. "We're just simple Southern folk here. You'll get used to it." After dinner, Evelyn brought out an old photo album and sat beside Lucas on the couch, flipping pages and reminiscing loudly about his ex-girlfriend, Stephanie. "She always helped me host the garden parties," Evelyn said. "Had the best taste. Not flashy, just tasteful." Lucas shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, I'm just reminiscing," Evelyn interrupted. Then, turning to Jasmine, "You remind me of her in some ways. Determined. Of course, Stephanie came from a good family, old Atlanta. I don't know where you're from again." "Chicago," Jasmine said evenly. "South Side." Evelyn nodded slowly, as if digesting something unpleasant. "Ah, well, I suppose that builds character." When Jasmine went to bed that night, the room felt colder than it should have. She stood in front of the mirror, brushing out her curls, and caught her own reflection staring back, distant and unreadable. She wasn't angry yet. What she felt was deeper, heavier, a kind of grief. But she had made a decision, and she would see it through. The party was in 3 days. She would make it perfect. Not because Evelyn deserved it, but because Jasmine did. And when it was done, no one would ever be able to say she hadn't tried. The morning sun filtered through gauzy white curtains, casting soft beams of light across the high ceilings of the guest bedroom. Jasmine sat upright on the edge of the antique four-poster bed, still dressed in her silk pajamas, hands folded in her lap. The room was beautiful, elegant in an outdated museum-like way, with dark mahogany furniture, faded floral wallpaper, and an overwhelming sense of stillness. She felt like she'd been placed on exhibit, a guest in every possible sense of the word. Through the door, she could hear the soft cadence of Evelyn's voice downstairs, directing someone, perhaps the housekeeper or one of the caterers. Everything in this house sounded deliberate, precise. There was no rushing, no casualness. Even the footsteps on the hardwood floors seemed rehearsed. Jasmine stood, pulling the satin tie of her robe tighter, and walked to the window. The view revealed the vast Whitmore estate in all its morning glory. Manicured hedges, sprawling oaks, and a circular driveway where a gardener was already tending to the beds of camellias. The sheer scale of the property never failed to strike her. It wasn't just wealth, it was legacy. That heavy, untouchable kind that passed through generations like old recipes and land deeds. She heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she said, turning. It was Lucas, freshly showered, a towel draped around his neck. He grinned when he saw her and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Morning," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "Morning," she replied, her voice tight with the effort of smiling. He pulled back slightly, studying her expression. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just feeling watched." Lucas chuckled, sitting beside her on the bed. "That's just Mom's way. She's used to being in control of everything. She's not trying to make you uncomfortable." "She doesn't have to try," Jasmine said quietly. Lucas sighed. "She'll soften. You're doing everything right. Just give her time." Jasmine didn't answer. Instead, she rose to dress, pulling a conservative blouse and slacks from her suitcase. Today, they would spend the day with Evelyn, helping with errands, walking through the venue, finalizing seating charts. Jasmine had volunteered to assist, hoping it would give them a chance to connect on more neutral ground. She had prepared herself mentally for polite conversation, passive-aggressive comments, and thin smiles. What she hadn't expected was how calculated everything would feel. Evelyn greeted her in the foyer with a brisk nod, dressed immaculately in a linen suit and kitten heels. Her makeup was flawless, her hair perfectly sculpted. "I assume you're ready?" she asked, not bothering with small talk. Jasmine nodded. "Yes, of course. Lucas will meet us later. He's handling some work calls this morning." Jasmine wasn't surprised. Lucas often assumed that women could handle these things on their own. Evelyn seemed to prefer it that way. The first stop was the venue, a grand hall on the outskirts of Savannah, surrounded by towering oaks and hanging moss. The inside was breathtaking. High ceilings with chandeliers, vintage mirrors lining the walls, and long banquet tables already arranged in precise symmetry. Jasmine had selected every detail with care. Evelyn wandered slowly through the room, eyes flitting from floral arrangements to table settings, occasionally pursing her lips or tapping a finger to her chin. "This tablecloth is a little bold," she remarked, gesturing to the ivory lace. "Not quite what I'd envisioned, but perhaps that's the modern way." "I thought it would complement the natural light," Jasmine said, resisting the urge to smooth the fabric nervously. "It does draw attention," Evelyn replied, "though I usually prefer understatement." Jasmine nodded, biting her tongue. They moved to the dessert table. Jasmine had ordered a selection of mini tarts, cakes, and pralines from a local black-owned bakery known for its traditional Southern recipes. She had sampled them personally, ensuring they met Evelyn's standards. "These aren't from LaBelle," Evelyn said, lifting one tart with manicured fingers. "We usually use them for our events." "I wanted to support a local vendor," Jasmine explained. "The pastry chef's grandmother taught her most of the recipes. Her peach cobbler is amazing." "I see," Evelyn said, setting the tart down without tasting it. "Well, we'll see how the guests respond." At the flower shop, Evelyn breezed through the displays like a woman inspecting inventory. She paused before a bouquet of azaleas, frowning. "I assume these are meant to be the centerpiece." "Yes," Jasmine said. "They're your favorites, right?" "They were my favorites in 1984, Evelyn replied, turning away. "I suppose that detail got lost." Every word, every glance felt like a test that Jasmine hadn't studied for. She found herself shrinking inwards, every instinct trained to stay poised, measured, unreadable. She had grown up learning how to adapt, how to survive in spaces that were not meant for her, but something about Evelyn's presence made the air itself feel thinner. Back at the house, Evelyn invited Jasmine for tea in the sitting room. Jasmine accepted, unsure if refusal would be taken as disrespect. They sat in stiff armchairs across from one another, a tray of porcelain cups and biscuits between them. Evelyn poured, her hand steady, her eyes never leaving Jasmine's face. "So," she began, "Lucas tells me you work in education." "Yes. I manage programs for charter schools and under-resourced communities." Evelyn sipped delicately. "That sounds very noble." "It's rewarding," Jasmine said. "Challenging, too. There's a lot of systemic—" Evelyn waved a hand. "Yes, yes. I'm sure you're very passionate. I've always admired women who give back. Of course, I do worry about the stability of such work. Lucas needs someone who understands long-term planning, financial prudence." Jasmine felt her stomach tighten. "I make a steady income," she replied, "and I'm starting a nonprofit next year. I've been saving." Evelyn smiled as if amused. "That's very entrepreneurial of you. I suppose we all have to find our way." She reached for a biscuit, then hesitated. "You know," she said, voice softening into something that sounded almost sincere, "Lucas has always had a generous heart, but he's also sensitive. He grew up with certain expectations, traditions. He's not the kind of man who thrives in conflict." "I'm not looking for conflict," Jasmine said carefully. "No, of course not. But marriage is complicated. Families even more so, especially when cultures differ." Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly. "What exactly do you mean?" Evelyn's smile didn't falter. "Just that it takes effort, patience. Some people never quite adjust." The conversation ended shortly after. Jasmine excused herself politely and returned to her room, where she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. The tea had left a bitter aftertaste. Over the next 2 days, the pattern repeated. Every interaction with Evelyn was laced with implication, compliments that were not compliments, questions that felt like interrogations. "You wear your hair natural," Evelyn observed once during breakfast. "It's very expressive." At dinner with some of Evelyn's friends, Jasmine was asked if she had ever been to Europe. "No," she had answered, "but I've traveled around the States for work." "Oh," one woman had said, tilting her head, "I just assumed with your aesthetic you might have studied fashion abroad." One morning, Jasmine overheard Evelyn speaking to a family friend on the phone. "She's very articulate," Evelyn said. "You'd never guess where she's from." Jasmine stood in the hallway, heart pounding, her nails digging into her palms. She was not a stranger to these kinds of moments. She had lived through them. But, coming from the woman whose approval Lucas so desperately wanted, they cut deeper. That night, as she and Lucas lay in bed, she tried to talk to him. "Your mother," she began, "says things, small things, but they add up." Lucas frowned. "Like what?" "She questions everything I do, every choice. It's constant, and it's not just about me. It's about race, class, culture. She doesn't see me as an equal. She's just formal, traditional." Jasmine turned to face him. "Would you say the same if she talked to me that way in a courtroom?" Lucas was quiet. "I'll talk to her," he said at last. "I promise." But he didn't. The next day, Evelyn continued as before, unaffected. Jasmine stopped expecting otherwise, and still she moved forward. The birthday celebration was only a day away. The final details had been arranged, the guest list confirmed. Everything would be flawless. But beneath the surface, something had begun to crack. A quiet splintering of hope, of patience, of the belief that effort could be enough. Jasmine had come here determined to build a bridge. Now she was beginning to understand that some people didn't want one. They preferred the distance. It made it easier to look down. By the time the morning of the party arrived, Jasmine felt like she had been holding her breath for days. The atmosphere in Evelyn's house had settled into a pattern of rigid politeness, a cold civility that was somehow more exhausting than outright hostility. Jasmine had endured Evelyn's sharp-edged commentary, the way she wielded her refined diction like a weapon, every phrase a barb wrapped in velvet. She had smiled through it all, bit her tongue, took notes, and worked. The day before the celebration, Jasmine woke before dawn and pulled on her running shoes. She didn't run often anymore, too many early mornings at work, too much responsibility. But today, she needed the air. She stepped out into the misty quiet of the Whitmore estate and took off down the gravel path that circled the property. Her breath coming out in short, controlled puffs, her arms pumping steadily. The trees loomed around her, ancient and silent, branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed like shrouds. She ran until her legs burned, until the tight coil in her chest loosened, even if just a little. Back in her room, she stood in front of the mirror and stared at her reflection. There were faint circles under her eyes, and her skin was drier than usual from the southern air, but she looked composed. She would not show weakness. She would not shrink. Today would be perfect. The final walkthrough at Lacewood Hall took place at 10. Jasmine arrived early, clipboard in hand, wearing a fitted navy dress and low heels, her hair styled in soft coils that framed her face. She had opted for elegance over flash, grace over boldness. She wanted no room for critique. The ballroom was already in the final stages of transformation. Round tables draped in lace stood beneath crystal chandeliers. Each centerpiece featured camellias and azaleas in antique silver vases, surrounded by small votive candles. She watched as the florist, a young woman named Yvonne, adjusted the arrangement on the head table, her dark fingers moving with gentle precision. "These look beautiful," Jasmine said. Yvonne smiled. "We wanted to keep it classic." "They're perfect." Jasmine moved around the room, checking off items on her list. The pianist arrived on time and began practicing quietly near the corner. The catering staff was already assembling platters in the kitchen, the scent of roasted pecans and fresh-baked bread filling the air. Everything was falling into place. Evelyn arrived just before noon, flanked by two of her oldest friends, Marjorie and Bernice, both women in their 70s with identical pearls and tight smiles. Jasmine greeted them warmly, extending a hand that was accepted with the kind of restraint reserved for unspoken judgments. "Well," Evelyn said, glancing around the hall, "you've certainly gone all out." Jasmine forced a smile. "I wanted it to be special." Evelyn turned to Marjorie. She even hired a jazz pianist. Marjorie raised a penciled-in brow. "How modern." Jasmine let the comment slide. She was becoming numb to them. They walked the perimeter of the room, Evelyn making notes aloud that were clearly intended more for her companions than for Jasmine. The flowers were a bit busy, the lighting perhaps too romantic, the menu adventurous. At one point, Evelyn stopped beside the dessert table. "I see you've chosen red velvet cake," she said. "A bold choice. Hopefully, it's not too sweet. Some palates are more refined." Jasmine looked at her steadily. "I tasted everything myself. I think the guests will be pleased." Evelyn smiled without teeth. "I'm sure they'll find it interesting." By afternoon, Jasmine had returned to the estate to change and finalize her notes. Lucas met her in the hallway as she came down the stairs. "Everything set?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. She nodded. "Just about. I'm going back in an hour to check on the seating." He leaned in to kiss her, but she pulled back slightly. "We need to talk." His expression shifted. "Now?" "No," she said. "After. After the party. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. Okay. The final preparations went by in a blur. Jasmine double-checked the name cards, adjusted the linen folds, confirmed the timing with the staff. She greeted early guests as they arrived, her smile poised, her energy practiced. She felt like a performer in an unfamiliar play, repeating lines written by someone else on a stage she hadn't built. The room filled quickly. Well-dressed men and women in their 50s and 60s greeted each other with soft laughter and air kisses. Jasmine noticed that she stood out in every corner. Hers was the only dark skin in the room, save for the caterers. She was introduced politely, nodded at, smiled at, but the warmth rarely reached the eyes. Evelyn entered precisely at 7, wearing a champagne-colored gown that glimmered subtly under the lights. She was escorted by a family friend and flanked by Lucas, who looked simultaneously proud and anxious. When she saw Jasmine, her smile tightened. "You've certainly created a spectacle," she said, eyes sweeping the room. Jasmine inclined her head. "Happy birthday, Evelyn." The evening unfolded in slow motion. The pianist played soft ballads. Hors d'oeuvres were passed on silver trays. Jasmine moved through the crowd like a hostess at her own wedding, introducing guests to one another, keeping conversations flowing, gently redirecting any off-handed remarks with a practiced ease. She could feel Evelyn's gaze on her at times, measuring, judging. Lucas was attentive but distant, pulled away often by relatives, colleagues, and old friends. When Jasmine caught his eye across the room, he offered a tired smile. The first real incident came during dinner. Jasmine was seated at the head table beside Lucas, directly across from Evelyn. The courses were served with precision, the conversation light, until Bernice leaned in. "So, Jasmine," she said sweetly, "do you plan to keep working once you and Lucas marry? Or will you focus more on domestic affairs?" Jasmine smiled politely. "I plan to keep working. I'm launching a nonprofit next year." "Oh," Bernice said, blinking. "Well, I suppose that's admirable, though I imagine that kind of work can be draining." "She has a passion for it," Lucas interjected. Evelyn sipped her wine. "Passion is important, of course, but so is stability, especially for someone in your position." Jasmine looked at her. "What position is that?" Evelyn met her gaze evenly. "Someone who's worked very hard to get where she is." There it was again, the underlying implication, the tightrope walk between praise and patronization, the suggestion that her success was surprising, conditional, delicate. Jasmine didn't respond. She returned her attention to her plate, breathing steadily. As the meal ended and dessert was served, Jasmine stepped away to check on the staff. In the hallway near the kitchen, she overheard two guests speaking quietly. "She's quite poised," one said. But it's all a bit much, isn't it?" the other replied. "So eager, so present." "She has to be," the first said. "She's not exactly one of them." Jasmine stood in the shadows, her hands clenched at her sides. She had spent weeks planning every detail of this night. And still, she was not one of them. She returned to the ballroom just in time for the speeches. Lucas tapped a spoon against his glass and stood. "Everyone," he said, "thank you for being here to celebrate my mother. Evelyn Whitmore is many things, elegant, intelligent, fiercely loyal, and tonight we honor her." Polite applause rippled through the room. Lucas smiled. "But most of all," he continued, "I want to thank the person who made this entire evening possible. Jasmine, my fiancée, who poured her heart into every detail. I'm so grateful for you." There was more applause, warmer this time. Jasmine smiled tightly, nodding her thanks, but her eyes remained on Evelyn. The older woman rose slowly, lifting her own glass. "Yes," she said, "let's raise a glass to an unforgettable evening." She stepped toward Jasmine, her expression unreadable. "And let us never forget," she continued, "that sometimes the boldest gestures come from the most unexpected places." Then, with deliberate carelessness, Evelyn tipped her glass. The wine, deep red, splashed in a slow arc across Jasmine's shoulder, soaking the delicate fabric of her dress. A gasp rippled through the room. Someone dropped a fork. Jasmine stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Evelyn smiled. "Oh, dear, these glasses are so slippery." Lucas jumped up. "Mom, what the hell?" "It was an accident," Evelyn said, dabbing at Jasmine's shoulder with a napkin that only spread the stain. "Don't make a scene." Jasmine stepped back, her hands raised. "No," she said softly. "No need." She turned and walked calmly from the room, the crowd parting around her in stunned silence. Behind her, Lucas called her name, but she didn't stop. Her heels echoed across the marble floor like the ticking of a clock, counting down to the end of something she had tried so hard to build. In the mirror of the hallway, she saw herself, dress ruined, wine dripping down her side, her eyes clear and dry. She looked regal, and she looked done. Jasmine did not cry. As she stepped out into the warm Savannah night, the sound of her heels softened by the gravel path, she felt her composure harden around her like a shell. The air was thick with the scent of gardenias, sweet and oppressive, and the faint music from inside the hall drifted after her like a ghost. She walked slowly, deliberately, away from the ballroom's glowing windows, away from the whispers and shocked faces, away from the stain spreading across her shoulder. The wine soaked through the fabric of her dress, clinging to her skin, sticky and cold, but she did not flinch. She had been through worse, much worse, and she would not give Evelyn Whitmore the satisfaction of seeing her unravel. She paused near the fountain at the edge of the courtyard and exhaled, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the only sound was the soft trickle of water. She touched the spot on her shoulder where the wine had landed, then looked at her stained fingertips. Red, vivid, almost theatrical. It would be poetic, she thought bitterly, if it didn't sting so much. The symbolism was too loud to ignore. Blood, humiliation, erasure masquerading as elegance. Evelyn had known exactly what she was doing. The door creaked behind her. Jasmine didn't turn. "Jazz?" Lucas's voice was quiet, cautious. She closed her eyes. "I didn't know what to say," he continued. "I was in shock. That wasn't. She didn't mean—" "Yes, she did," Jasmine said without looking at him. "Don't do that." He fell silent. After a long pause, he stepped closer. "Can we go somewhere and talk?" She finally turned to face him. His face was drawn, pale under the amber glow of the patio lights. He looked shaken, but not surprised. And that, more than anything, struck her as the deepest betrayal. "You watched it happen," she said. "You saw her pour wine on me, and you did nothing. I didn't know how to react. Everyone was watching." "They've always been watching," Jasmine snapped, her voice rising. "They were watching me the moment I walked into that house. Every word, every step, every smile. Waiting for me to stumble so they could nod to each other and say, 'See? She doesn't belong here.' And you could have stopped it. You could have said something. But you let her humiliate me. Publicly, in front of your friends, your family." "I didn't mean to," he said, but his voice was small. "That's the problem, Lucas," she said quietly. "You never mean to, but you let it happen anyway." She walked past him without another word, back into the building. Inside, the party was still going, albeit more subdued now. The music had resumed, glasses clinked, Laughter, forced and thin, hovered like mist. Guests glanced at her as she passed, some with pity, others with discomfort. No one said anything. In the bathroom, Jasmine locked the door behind her and stood before the mirror. Her reflection was calm, composed, regal. The wine stain had spread, blooming across the fabric like a wound. She unzipped the dress and let it slide to the floor. In her slip, she washed her skin in the sink, the cold water shocking her back into herself. She wiped her face with a paper towel and reapplied her lipstick with steady hands. Then she picked up the ruined dress and carried it out with her like a banner. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. She found her purse, thanked the staff, and quietly told the manager to close out the final invoice. She walked past Evelyn without a word. The older woman stood with a small circle of guests, one hand still holding her wineglass, her expression smooth and untouched by remorse. She made no move to apologize. Lucas hovered near the exit, his face pale and drawn, but Jasmine walked past him too. Outside, she ordered her own ride and waited alone on the curb until it arrived. No one followed her. No one tried to stop her. Back at Evelyn's estate, the house was dark. Jasmine moved through the halls in silence, her heels muffled by the antique rugs. In the guest room, she sat on the edge of the bed and peeled off her shoes. Her feet throbbed, her back ached, her heart was quiet. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in the armchair by the window and watched the moon move across the sky. Her thoughts came slowly, methodically, as if her mind were sorting through a filing cabinet of memories, each interaction with Evelyn, each conversation with Lucas, each microaggression carefully dressed as civility. She thought of her mother, her grandmother, all the women who had taught her that silence was sometimes survival, that composure could be armor. She had worn that armor well, but now it felt too heavy to carry. At sunrise, she packed her things. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final word exchanged. She folded her dress into a garment bag, packed her heels in tissue paper, and zipped up her suitcase. On the dresser, she left the engagement ring in its box, placed neatly atop a handwritten note. 3 sentences. Simple, final. Thank you for loving me, for a while. I wanted to believe love could change everything, but I won't erase myself to fit your world. She wheeled her suitcase down the stairs just as the house began to stir. Evelyn stood in the foyer, already dressed, a mug of coffee in her hand. Her expression was unreadable. "You're leaving?" she asked, as though surprised. Jasmine didn't answer. She didn't owe her one. Lucas appeared at the top of the stairs, hair tousled, eyes wide with sleep and regret. "Jazz, please, just wait. Can we talk?" She looked up at him once, then away. "No," she said. She walked out the door and didn't look back. At the airport, she sat by the window and watched planes taxi across the tarmac. Her phone buzzed with messages, apologies, explanations, pleadings, but she ignored them. She booked a flight to Chicago and closed her eyes as the boarding call echoed through the terminal. The plane lifted into the sky, the earth falling away beneath her. For the first time in days, she exhaled fully. She was free. Not unscathed, not untouched, but unbroken. Back home, her apartment welcomed her like a warm bath. Familiar walls, familiar smells. She opened the windows, let in the cold wind, and unpacked slowly. Each item she removed from her suitcase felt like shedding someone else's expectations. In the following days, she returned to her routine. She held meetings, mentored students, attended a conference on education equity. Her colleagues greeted her with warmth, her friends with concern. She didn't tell them everything. Not yet. Some wounds required time before they could be spoken aloud, but something inside her had shifted. The part of her that had once longed for approval now pulsed with something stronger: clarity. She had tried, with grace, with strength, with every ounce of love she had. And it had not been enough. Not because she wasn't enough, but because some doors were never meant to open. Some hearts stayed shut no matter how gently you knocked. She began drafting a proposal for her nonprofit, a project she had dreamed about for years. It would offer mentorship and scholarships to Black girls in underserved neighborhoods, focusing not just on academic success, but on identity, confidence, and resilience. She named it the Mirror Project, a reflection of self-worth, untouched by someone else's definition. When she launched the website, she included a photo of herself in the champagne dress, the wine stain edited into a soft pink glow. Beneath it was a quote from her grandmother: "They will call your strength arrogance, your clarity defiance, your presence disruption. But stand anyway." She smiled as she clicked publish. The party Evelyn had tried to use as a spectacle of control had become something else entirely. Not a memory of shame, but a catalyst, a beginning. Jasmine knew she would carry the red stain with her for a long time. Not as a mark of humiliation, but as proof. Proof that she had stood in the lion's den and refused to bow. Proof that she had loved, lost, and still chosen herself. The celebration was over, but her life, finally, was hers. The first snow of the season fell softly over Chicago, powdering the city in a delicate veil that muted its usual clamor. Jasmine stood at the window of her apartment, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the flakes swirl and settle on the fire escape. The sky was the color of ash, and the wind whispered around the old building like a warning. But inside her apartment, it was quiet, still. A sanctuary carved out of the noise. It had been 3 weeks since Savannah. 3 weeks since she walked out of Evelyn Whitmore's house, with her head held high and her heart shattered in silence. 3 weeks since she left the ring on the dresser and closed the door on a future she had once imagined with certainty. The days since then had moved in waves, some gentle, others crashing, some filled with determination, others with grief so sharp it felt like swallowing glass. But she had kept moving, one foot in front of the other, forward. The city, with its indifferent beauty, had welcomed her back like an old friend. She buried herself in work, long hours at the school and evenings spent drafting the framework for her nonprofit. The Mirror Project was no longer an abstract idea scribbled in notebooks. It was becoming something real, something necessary. And in its creation, she found not distraction, but direction. Still, some nights, like this one, memories rose unbidden. She could still feel the weight of Evelyn's gaze, cold and appraising, the hush that fell over the ballroom as the wine soaked through her dress, the way the laughter resumed minutes later, as if her humiliation had been no more than an intermission. She remembered the look on Lucas's face, not shock, not rage, but helplessness, as though watching a car crash from behind glass. He had called, of course, left voicemails, sent long emails filled with apologies and explanations. She had read them all, and then deleted them. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. She had loved him. She would probably always love the version of him she had first met, the man who had leaned in during that panel discussion, eyes lit with shared passion, the man who had kissed her hand under a starlit sky and promised her the world. But that man had not been strong enough to fight for her. And that made all the difference. Her phone buzzed on the table behind her. She didn't move. She already knew who it was. Lucas's messages came less frequently now, but they still arrived, always at night, as if regret lived in him only when the day's distractions had faded. She turned away from the window and walked to her desk. A stack of applications waited. Young girls from across the city who had heard about the Mirror Project and wanted to be seen. She opened the first one, a ninth grader named Tyla. Bright, curious. Her essay described growing up in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than textbooks, where people mistook silence for obedience and dreams for foolishness. Jasmine read the words carefully, her chest tightening with recognition. She wrote back immediately, inviting Tyla to a one-on-one session the following week. The next morning, Jasmine rose early and dressed with intention. A slate-gray turtleneck, tailored trousers, gold hoop earrings. She braided her hair into a crown and stepped out into the snow. The wind bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed the sting. It reminded her she was alive, real, and moving through a world that did not deserve her silence. She met with donors that afternoon, presenting the mission of the Mirror Project with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. The men and women across the table, some skeptical, some intrigued, asked pointed questions about budgeting, scalability, long-term goals. Jasmine answered each one without flinching. By the end of the meeting, 2 had offered seed funding. A third requested a formal proposal by the end of the month. She walked out into the snow feeling lighter. That evening, she sat at her desk again, scrolling through emails when she saw one with the subject line, Lacewood Hall Photos. She hesitated. The photographer, someone hired by Evelyn, someone Jasmine had barely interacted with, had apparently sent the files to both her and Lucas by default. For a moment, Jasmine hovered the cursor over the trash icon, but then something stopped her. She opened the folder. There they were. Dozens of images. The glittering ballroom, the flowers, the guests, champagne glasses raised, laughter frozen in time. Evelyn, in her sequined gown, surrounded by admirers. Lucas smiling, holding Jasmine's hand. Jasmine, poised, radiant, unaware. And then, the final photo. The moment the wine hit her. It was captured mid-pour, the red liquid arcing through the air just beginning to bloom across the pale fabric of her dress. Her eyes were wide, lips parted slightly, not in horror, but in disbelief. Around her, faces blurred into shadow, but her expression was sharp, clear, unforgettable. She stared at it for a long time. Then, she saved the image to a new folder labeled Origin. Later that week, she printed it on heavy paper and pinned it to the wall above her desk. Not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of the moment she stopped asking for permission to exist. She called Yvonne, the florist from Savannah, and thanked her again for the arrangements. They spoke for nearly an hour, about the business, about being black women in industries that rarely made room for them, about how the smallest details often carried the heaviest truths. "Are you okay?" Yvonne asked finally. Jasmine paused. "I think I'm becoming." Yvonne laughed softly. "That's better than okay." On Sunday, Jasmine met Tyla at a local cafe. The girl was small for her age, with oversized glasses and a voice that barely rose above a whisper. But when she spoke about her dreams, becoming a marine biologist, traveling to Australia, starting her own mentoring program, her eyes lit up. "No one really listens to me like that," she said at one point. "They just say, 'Good job,' and move on." "I'm listening," Jasmine said, "and I see you." The words made the girl's eyes water. Jasmine reached across the table and squeezed her hand. When she returned home that night, Jasmine sat on the floor of her living room, her back against the couch, and cried for the first time since the party. Not out of sadness, but from the sheer relief of being free, from expectations, from performance, from the exhausting hunger for approval. She thought again of her grandmother, who had once said, "Don't give them your tears, baby, but don't lose them for yourself either." She wept until the tightness in her chest loosened, until her body stopped trembling, until she could breathe again. When the tears dried, she stood and poured herself a glass of wine, not red, but white. She sipped it slowly, savoring the cool clarity. Then she returned to her desk and opened a new document. Title: The Mirror Manifesto. She began to write. It was not an academic paper, nor a speech. It was a declaration, a truth. The black girls would not be confined by someone else's expectations of elegance. That dignity did not require silence. That survival was not the same as submission. That to exist, fully and unapologetically, was not an act of defiance, but of reclamation. She wrote deep into the night, her fingers moving without hesitation, the words pouring from her like a river breaking free of its dam. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the photograph pinned above her. The red stain, once a symbol of shame, now felt like a badge, not of victimhood, but of victory. By early spring, the city had shed its winter coat. The snow had receded into gutters and storm drains, leaving behind streets that glistened with rain and sun. Trees along the boulevards stretched toward the sky with a hunger that mirrored Jasmine's own. Branches blooming pink and white, petals falling like soft confetti onto the sidewalks. The world was waking up again, and with it, Jasmine felt something inside her stirring back to life. The Mirror Project had moved from blueprint to birth. The office space, a modest but sunlit corner unit in a co-working building on the south side, smelled of fresh paint and hope. Jasmine had spent days arranging the furniture herself, bringing in framed quotes from black women leaders, a shelf of books that had once guided her through her own metamorphosis, and a large corkboard where photos of the first cohort of girls now smiled back at her. Tyla's face was there, in the center, grinning behind those thick glasses with an expression of cautious pride. Jasmine had chosen each of them carefully. 10 girls from across the city, all of them black, all of them bright, all of them quietly carrying the weight of being underestimated. They met 3 times a week in the space, engaging in sessions Jasmine called reflections, where they talked not just about their goals and education, but about identity, fear, anger, and joy. Jasmine invited guest speakers, poets, activists, entrepreneurs, women who looked like them and knew what it meant to be seen as both too much and not enough. The project had grown faster than she'd expected. Donations continued to come in after a local news story featured her efforts, a segment that included a quiet moment where Jasmine had described the night of the party in vague terms, an experience that made her realize she would no longer wait to be given permission to exist. "It was the moment I stopped trying to earn my seat at someone else's table," she had said, "and decided to build my own." The segment had gone viral. Messages from other women, black women especially, had poured into her inbox for days afterward. Some told their own stories. Others simply wrote thank you. Jasmine read every message. Some she answered. Others she kept, like prayers folded into a journal. It had been 3 months since Savannah. 3 months since the wine. Since the silence. Since the choice to leave behind the version of herself that would have swallowed the indignity for the sake of decorum. Lucas had stopped reaching out. After her final message, clear and unflinching, he had respected her boundary. There was grief in that, too, in the quiet. But Jasmine had learned to sit with grief without letting it consume her. Some days it visited like a guest. Other days it was just a shadow in the background. And then, in late April, the letter arrived. It was on ivory stationery, the envelope thick and expensive. The return address was embossed in silver script, Whitmore Residence, Savannah, Georgia. Jasmine stood in the doorway of her office, the letter in her hand, her breath lodged somewhere between her ribs and her throat. She stared at the envelope for a long time before sliding her thumb beneath the seal and opening it. The handwriting was delicate, deliberate. Jasmine, I assume by now you are no longer interested in anything I have to say. And I would not blame you. I'm not writing to apologize, at least not in the way you may expect. There are some things that cannot be undone, no matter how sincerely one regrets them. But I have seen what you've built. I've read about your work. I've watched the video. And I realize now that you never needed my approval. You only needed space. What I did at the party was unforgivable. I told myself it was accidental, but I know better. It was calculated, petty, and cruel. I was not drunk. I was angry. And I used the weapon I knew would draw blood without leaving a bruise. You did not deserve that. No one does. Lucas is lost. He may not say so, but he is. You were the best thing that ever happened to him. He let fear win, and I taught him how. I do not expect you to respond. I'm not writing for redemption, only to acknowledge that you saw me clearly and that you were right to leave. Evelyn Whitmore. Jasmine read the letter twice, then a third time. She felt no satisfaction, no vindication, only a strange, quiet release. She folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the others. Notes from donors, thank yous from students, stories from strangers. Then she returned to her desk and opened her calendar. The next week was full. New applications, a fundraising dinner, a planning meeting for the summer intensive. She scrolled through the days with a small smile, grateful for the weight of responsibility, for the constancy of work rooted in meaning. That Friday, Jasmine hosted the first open house at the Mirror Project. Parents, teachers, mentors, and community leaders filtered in through the glass doors, admiring the space, asking questions and congratulating her. A local pastor spoke briefly. One of the girls read a poem. There was laughter, food, applause, and in the center of it all stood Jasmine, calm, centered, and whole. At the end of the evening, as the last guest drifted out, a young woman approached her. She was tall, no older than 22, with dark skin and braids down her back. I just wanted to say thank you, the woman said. I didn't have anything like this when I was younger. I wish I had, but it's enough knowing that these girls do now. Jasmine smiled. It's never too late to find your mirror. The woman's eyes shimmered. She nodded and left. Later, Jasmine stood alone in the space. The lights dimmed, the quiet settling over her like a soft blanket. She looked around at what she had created. Not just an office, not just a program, but a sanctuary, a revolution. On the wall behind her desk, the photograph still hung, the one from the party, the moment the wine hit her shoulder. A single image frozen in time, transformed now into something sacred, not shame, but proof. Not humiliation, but passage. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, its skyline a jagged silhouette against the lavender dusk. She thought of her mother, who had worked 3 jobs to feed her children. Of her grandmother, who had stood in voting lines for hours, even when they tried to turn her away. Of the girls whose names were already beginning to echo in classrooms and community halls. Of the ones who were still waiting to be seen. and she thought finally of herself. Not as she had been at the party, elegant, careful, trying, but as she was now, rooted, resilient, reborn. There would be more battles, more rooms where she would be the only one, more eyes that judged her before she spoke. But there would also be joy, triumph, creation, a legacy of her own design. Jasmine turned from the window, switched off the lights, and locked the door behind her. Not with an ending, but with a beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video for another powerful story, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.